Good afternoon, committee. As we are, well, looky here, we've got a gavel for appropriations, so that's nice. So snooze, you lose, I guess. All right. Today we're going to have a hopefully somewhat at least a discussion on the resolution that we might take up next week or very soon on the Legislature Prairie Chicken. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But first, we will have bill introductions, and we'll call on Randy Stuckey from Kansas Feed and Grain. So, Mr. Stuckey, welcome to the committee.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. For those that don't know me, there's some new faces on the committee. My name is Randy Stuckey, and I serve as General Counsel and Senior Vice President of Government Affairs for a few different agribusiness associations in Kansas, principally the Kansas Grain and Feed Association. That's the grain elevators in the state. The Kansas Agribusiness Retailers Association. That's exactly what it sounds like, the ag retailers in the state. And then the third association is the association that's seeking to introduce a bill today, and that's Renew Kansas Biofuels Association, representing the biofuel facilities, the ethanol and biofuel facilities in the state of Kansas. And so on behalf of Renew Kansas, Mr. Chairman, we would request introduction of a bill this afternoon. It is 23 RS 0685, and concerning an amendment to the Kansas Carbon Dioxide Reduction Act and seeking a state permitting authority for UIC Class 6 carbon sequestration injection wells. That sounds like a mouthful, but really it's just for the ethanol plants. They emit CO2, carbon dioxide, in the fermentation process. We'd like to capture that, compress it, and then sequester it in the ground, take advantage of some California markets for carbon sequestration and low carbon fuel standards. And the bill will help to allow us to do that. Our industry and others, but that's what the bill does.
All right. Any questions? Seeing none, the bill has been introduced.
And Mr. Chairman, if you don't
yes,
mind.
Go ahead.
Terrific.
We have
Thank you very much.
Here.
So today is our Kansas Grain and Feed Association and Kansas Agribusiness Retailers Association, and in partnership with the Kansas Cooperative Council, it's our legislative action day at the Capitol. So hopefully a lot of our members have been getting around to see you today and speaking to you about some of the issues that are important to us this year that we are following and supporting. We have some members in the audience today, and I just thank you for the time to recognize our associations.
I'm sorry. Yes.
So,
thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's what happens when you start pretty close to on time. I'm going to give me extra time to get this done. Okay. Any other bill introductions? Seeing none, we will go. This is going to be a fairly informal discussion. That's what it is, a discussion. And this is something we don't typically do a lot of, and that are resolutions within a committee or a joint resolution with the Senate. And we do not have a House version for you to sign on and other House members if you would like to. And so we will gather sponsors of it before it goes. So after I thought about that, before we jumped into it, I thought we'll probably want to do it next week. You know, the Senate tried to rush it through. The reason why we tried to rush this through was just the timeliness of what's going on in the federal government. We'll talk about that in just a little bit. But as we have done over the last couple of weeks, and our committee member has been in committee, he's just been not in this physical room. So Representative Jacobs, if you would introduce yourself, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Representative Jacobs, 4th District, Bourbon County, Lynn County, and it's always a pleasure to be here in Ag. I've been on this committee for 6 years. Thank you.
All right, very good. Thank you very much. And he has been he's always been on, but he's been online, and he's got lots going on. So thanks for being here in person. So Anyway, so let's get back to the matter at hand, and what has happened and transpired. We talked a little bit about it yesterday. Is the federal government has enlisted the lesser prairie chicken in portions of Kansas in its area as part of the endangered species, and it was going to go into effect, that listing, yesterday, but the administration has now moved it now to April 27th, I believe, and March 27th? Well, do you believe KLA? I mean, come on, no. Hey, March 27th, that's right. What's April 27th? That's right, 60 days, you're right. There must be something important on April 27th. Is that my anniversary? I don't know. Oh, okay. Oh, that must be it. Maybe that's the beat. Is that the beat? Your birthday? Well, that's why. That's what I was thinking about, you know, the cake I was going to bake for you. But all right. Anyway, so March 27th. So, and also even since that time, we have, I believe, some organizations have already sued for the situation. This happened about 10 years ago, and so, in a nutshell, right quick, we're using the same language that the Senate is using, where it supports our Kansas delegation, Senators Marshall and Moran, and then there's a Senate Joint Resolution 70, and then Representative Estes, LaTurner, and Mann co-sponsored a House Joint Resolution. And basically, this is just affirming what that resolution says, and that is Kansas knows what's best for Kansas, and that this is not necessary and should not be undertaken because of the economic harm it could do to Kansas. And this was happened, like I say, about a decade ago. So what you will find, if we don't have, we will have some testimony from Ed Cross from the Kansas Oil and Independent Gas Association that you will have, that'll be part of the record as well on the impact it could have on them. And also, we have just some, want to bring one of our committee members to talk about the, oh, yes, Representative Jacobs.
If I may, is there any copies or any paperwork for the Senate Joint Resolution 70?
You did not send it.
105?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, you will get a copy of it. You want to send that right quick? Okay. I apologize. I thought we had that sent out.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So, because you're good. I'm glad that look. You did get it. Oh, we understand that. So I guess it is there. It came probably what? 141. Yeah. It does not say House, so it says the Senate Concurrent Resolution 1602. Yeah, okay.
I was referring, I guess, and maybe I'm on House or current Senate Resolution 1602 on lines 31 and 32 when it talks about the Senate Joint Resolution 70 and the House Joint Resolution 105.
Those are the federal ones. If you
Right.
look at
That's what I was wondering, if we had any copies of those.
I don't. We can sure get you some, I'm sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Sure. I'm going to call on Representative White from Clark County, who has had some experience with the lesser prairie chicken. You know, as we look at this, and the reason why we want to affirm what our federal delegation believes is that the impact it could have on maybe, and it has had on your ranching operation and so on. So if you could share some personal experiences of how those birds have affected your operation.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I am Gary White. I'm from Ashland. That's about 50 miles south of Dodge City. And one of my pieces of ground that I farm is the first, there's a highway and there's like 1,000 or 1,500 acres of pasture. And then my wheat field. I have maybe 300 acres of wheat there. And when I first started farming that, there was a herd or a flock of prairie chickens. I would see them every morning out on my wheat field, flying back over to nesting in the pasture, and every evening come back. And I counted them, started naming them. There was probably 15 or 20 of them. And I noticed, like in the good wet years, the pasture was getting hairy. There was some CRP out there, and those they grew. It got up to 20 or 25, but every morning and every night, flying over that fence, barbed wire fence, and then Jim Sipe, Farm Bureau, they did this before. Prairie chicken, listed them. Jim Sipe, Farm Bureau, just went in deep dive and tried to educate everybody about it. And one of the things they said in Washington, somebody behind the desk said, if you can't build a barbed wire fence because a prairie chicken won't fly over it. I saw it twice a day for a long time, 15 years of it. But that flock is gone. There was a hunting season for falconers. There's a guy that came down from Montana every year. Well, he asked me one time, can I go out there and take a couple? Sure. Well, 4 or 5 years later, they were gone. He killed them all. I just heard about a year ago, he's passed away, and I just didn't weep very much because he never asked again. I could have told him, no, the numbers are thinning, because I would see less and less and less. So it wasn't anything I did as a farmer. I fed them. I did notice their population go up and then go down in wet years and dry years. And if you notice, we're kind of cycling back through a dry season. The prairie chicken numbers are down, and it's not because of the falconers or hunters or farmers. It's just the natural cycle of things. So with that, I'll conclude. Thank you.
I think as we look at this, on this resolution, in looking at lines 23 through 25, where it says the resolutions would affirm the rights of farmers, ranchers, and energy producers to control their lands and continue their existing proactive measures to protect the lesser prairie chicken. So that is probably one of the keys in all this. It is not a very long resolution. It doesn't go into much detail. It is something that the chairman of the Senate Ag Committee and I thought was important that we as a state try to take a stand and say that Kansas knows what's best for Kansans. And it's a situation that did resolve itself last time the weather pattern turned off wet, is just to put it quite bluntly. So, yes, Representative Roth.
If the chickens were to be put on the endangered species list, what would happen to ranch land and farmland? That's my question. I don't know.
I'll also call Mr. Cross up if you would talk also about how it could impact the energy industry. But the way I understand it is that other agencies then would have folks, not the rancher, determine a grazing plan and an operational plan that would have to be approved by other committees. And so you would get bogged down. It would probably be a timing and situations maybe with how fencing is and so on. And so it would really impede, say, a grazing season or a rancher or a cattle grazer's ability to do their yearly grazing plan. So, Mr. Cross, if you wouldn't mind coming and addressing from an energy standpoint, what would happen if this does go into effect here now in less than 60 days?
Edward Cross, and I'm president of the Kansas Independent Oil and Gas Association. And like I said, it was supposed to go into effect yesterday. It's going to be March 27th, and they divided that out. They're going to list it as threatened in Kansas, in the northern segment, and endangered in the southern segment, which is western Texas, eastern New Mexico. So they do have conservation plans, and from the oil and gas industry, those are very burdensome and expensive. They impose restrictions on oil and gas operations and requires payment of significant fees to be mitigation fees in order to do the projects. These conservation programs and compensatory permit requirements are on privately held ag and oil and gas operation, and that constitutes what we would think is a privilege tax for funding government wildlife conservation programs. So, the question is, do they really have the authority to impose such plans on private property? And that's one of the things that we would do that. So, the conservation plans, the operators would have to sign up for mitigation plans with these habitat conservation plans, and then pay a mitigation fee where they would get conservation lands to offset whatever lands that you're using for your operations, and there's significant fees, as well as other restrictions on when you can do the operations, and you also can't do it through from March through July. You can't get out there before 9 a.m. in the morning, things like that. So that greatly restricts activity in Kansas.
We do have Mr. Cross's testimony. All right. We do have Mr. Cross's testimony now just emailed to you, so if you want to review the testimony or comments that he will have as part of the record, so just want you to be aware of that. Representative Blex, do you have a question or comment?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Comment. A little bit of experience in this area. I'm a retired wildlife biologist, more experience with graders than lessers, but it's similar. On the lek grounds, which is breeding grounds or booming grounds, as some people will call them, the males come in traditionally and drum and attract females. And Dr. Robel from K-State done quite a bit of study on that, at least on the graders, and about the same thing's true with lessers, that they have a natural aversion to any permanent structure, whether that be an oil pump jack, a building, or anything else, if it's near a lek. And we are seeing a shrinking numbers. However, having said that, the real problem is with the feds stepping in and overreach, because the states, Kansas and Oklahoma and Colorado, had a state agreement to deal with this and had a stall out and had a management plan. And certainly they're cyclic. Grouse populations, whether it's rough greater or lesser chickens or sharptails in Nebraska, have always been cyclic. So on the wet years, and particularly in these dry areas, and in particularly in that sand sage prairie where it's primarily their habitat, you will see a decline. And of course, in those declines, and how the listing operates, at least at the state level, you have university professors that make recommendations. The non-game biologist in the state of Kansas who's Ed Miller from Independence, my hometown, I actually hired, was in on the interview, and good head, very common sense, certainly not a tree hugger, and he understands the conservation issue, not so much a preservation. But they all meet, and they look at survey numbers, and somebody comes up and they make a recommendation. And at this point, it doesn't make any difference whether it's species in need of conservation or threatened or endangered. The end result's the same to the producer, and it is an impact. And of course, I've always been alone in that. If there's going to be a impact on how you conduct your operations, I farm and run cattle, so I understand fully on the family farm. If there's going to be an impact for public good, then the public good must make a payment in lieu of whatever your impact is. And certainly in the case with oil and gas, probably that restriction would only be during a booming ground, but we get a lot of horror stories. I don't see access being an issue. I see grazing possibly being an issue. And hopefully if this come about, which I don't support it. I'm very strong on private rights, and I don't support a mandatory issue. And I've lived long enough to know that a lot of them are cyclic. Representative Gardner and I were just talking. I can remember when my country was full of greater prairie chickens, black-tailed jackrabbits, and a lot of other things. and now they're pretty much gone. And, you know, that's a habitat issue. And that's a loss we're all dealing with. And I can go through a long, lengthy explanation as to why on certain species. But the real problem, in my opinion, is having the federal government come in and extend the overreach, because I've dealt with those federal biologists, and some of them are smart, but boy, when it comes to common sense, they're right there. They don't have it. So a lot of this stuff gets shoved down our throats, and if they just let the states manage it and work it out, there wouldn't be the problem that we're having. But unfortunately, it's happening at the federal level. So, and I'm certainly not opposed to the resolution, but there's a lot more to it than probably the average person in this room understands. They are shrinking, and there is some issues, but I'm not sure anything we can do too much is going to change that. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Representative Jacobs?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Could somebody tell me where exactly is their habitat in the state? How much of this real estate would, or with this ruling, would affect our state? Is it from I-35 west, or, you know, give me geographics if somebody could, please. Thank you.
Representative Minix, you know, you kind of live this too, so.
I live it. I had them on my ground in Scott County. Generally, I would say the predominantly probably west of Dodge City on a north-south line. And there's quite a bit in north central Texas, Oklahoma Panhandle, not north central Texas, the Panhandle, I'm sorry, a little bit into New Mexico, eastern Colorado, very western part of Kansas, and maybe up into Nebraska a little bit. The drier, more arid areas. And one of the reasons they tend to be in tall grass, they like to be in what you call conservation reserve grass. I had a 30-year contract that was out in about 2011, and I put it back in for another 30 years. 2012 came along, and it was really dry, and the federal started squawking about calling the prairie chickens threatened or endangered. I went in and paid off my first payment and my interest, took my penalties, and I got that ground out of CRP grass. I made it a part of the remainder of the pasture right there. It was a small acreage, 67 acres. I did not want to deal with being told what the stocking rate on my grassland would be, restricted access, lots of things. They don't want you to build any structure close to it. I'm guessing on oil wells and power poles are a perch for their predators, which are hawks basically, which damages the lesser prairie chicken population. But that's my personal experience. But 2 days ago, I heard Brad Lovelace at another presentation say, and he's the, Secretary of Wildlife and Parks? He said there's a lot of complicating factors here, and there's even a discussion whether there's a difference between a lesser and a greater prairie chicken, and maybe Doug can help me out here. He said they took some DNA samples from way back. They're not so sure that they're actually two different subspecies. They're maybe the same, and they're just slightly different size due to the habitat. And in his opinion, if the federal government would come in, they determine the categories of threatened or endangered by what percent of population remains today of what some estimated population might have been many, many years ago. He said they came in and counted what we call the lesser prairie chickens. He said if you'd add the population of the greater prairie chickens to that, maybe we're not even on that threshold of needing to call something threatened or endangered. In my experience, the 2012 drought receded. We had some good moisture years. The bird numbers came up. They're not supposed to be out in short grass. They're still in my pasture. That ground that was CRP grass that I graze and stock today and do it economically, they're still there booming in the spring.
Representative Blex?
One of the problems with endangered species, they have a verbiage in there called take. And take is fairly broad. In other words, if a federal protected species goes in at night and flies into an uncovered oil pit and due to the sheen looking like it's water, then we've had agents, and I was a retired wildlife agent, so I understand, had to work with some of those. And they had agents that would want to write tickets and count birds in slimy oil because they flew into that, and that fit for the legal definition of take. And that becomes a huge problem with the issues there that, you know, you're doing things that you don't think is impacting such as something like disking or whatever. And yet we got another group of people that's classifying that as take. And that's a real problem. And, you know, we've dealt with some issues on that. And I have actually seen when, and Representative Gardner, I was just talking about the number of prairie chickens in our area, my own farm, and how they've actually expanded in Ellsworth area and Lincoln counties. You're actually seeing a lot more greater prairie chickens. Eureka used to be kind of the cold prairie chicken capital of Kansas, and it's shifted a lot. So we're actually seeing an increase in graders in some of that area around in Lincoln County and Ellsworth up in there from historically what was. And I think the same thing will be true with the lessers if we give them time and don't overreact, which the feds apparently have. They did not listen to the state biologist. For the most part, the state biologist did not advocate what's going on. They've superseded and went above it. Matter of fact, the recommendations, they had the plan in place with Colorado and Oklahoma and Kansas, and it went by the wayside with the change in administration.
Can you explain, you say lesser and greater, and I know there's not much different, but can you explain, are there big differences between the greater prairie chicken and the lesser prairie chicken, and why do we just call them prairie chickens?
Well, there's a little bit of difference. The lesser obviously is smaller. That's the first thing. It's lesser. Not much difference. The plumage is a little bit different in the pointing of it. It's not like a sharp tail that has a dark V. The tympanum sac on the side, which you'll see a lot in the breeding season, is a deep red orange on a greater, and on a lesser it's kind of a yellow, and that's real evident on the males during that breeding season. They have a little smaller pinnacle, little feather out there, but really if you're just looking at them flying, the characteristics are the same. They're very difficult to determine. I know that's a lesser because of where I'm at geographically, more than anything else.
Okay. Representative Schlingen, I'm going to get this right. Schlingen-Siepen. There we go.
Representative Blex, do these species, the greater and the lesser, do they breed with each other, or are they from a species point of view separate in that regard? I mean, if they can breed with one another, then they could be arguably a single species, and the argument for the larger numbers would certainly make sense. But if they don't, do they?
Mr. Chair, that's tough. It takes DNA to really know the difference. For the most part, it's geographically exclusive. So if you have lesser chickens in Sage Prairie and Garden City and Dodge City, and there's no graders, there's not any breeding, and some of that range where they may slightly overlap, it's possible, but not real likely.
If I may, so it may be simply that they have specialized in different niches and therefore don't crossbreed because they're specialized in those particular eco niches, and therefore.
For the most part, but that's not a hard and fast rule. Turkeys, we introduced eastern turkeys in Rio Grandes from Oklahoma and Merriam's from some even from the northwest along the Nebraska side, and they interbreed. And we got in trouble. I say we, it's been a long time since I worked for that agency, but we have people that do grand slams. They travel around the United States shooting a Rio Grande turkey, a eastern turkey, a Merriam's turkey, and the subspecies in Florida. I can't remember that now. And they get very specific as to what they want. And I trapped a lot of the turkeys in my career, and we actually had to pull, we looked at plumage. for the most part, to identify the difference between a Rio Grande and a Eastern turkey, because a Rio Grande has kind of a buff band around the tail, where Eastern, which is primarily Missouri, has a chocolate brown. And we actually had to start doing DNA samples. Whenever we'd trap, we'd pull blood to actually determine, because a professional biologist in the field couldn't tell it. And this may be a little bit true with the lesser and greater.
Thank you, Representative. Schling and Siepen, there we go. I'm going to make sure I got it right. Those in the audience and committee members, last year we had the box turtle, and this year it's the Lesser Prairie chicken. You're coming away with a lot of knowledge that hopefully you can use it at cocktail parties or whatever. Representative Minix.
I would be interested to test Secretary Lovelace's theory. He said they tested DNA from some samples that had been frozen from many, many years ago, that one was identified as lesser and another as greater. To pose a question to you, if I took a pair of lessers from my area that are identified as lessers to the different habitat, and they had offspring there, if the color and the plumage would not turn into what someone would identify as a greater due to the difference in the plant wildlife, their habitat, and everything else. If you can't tell the difference in the DNA, what's the difference in those birds? To me, it's the habitat that they grew up in. And we as humans try to identify them by their plumage and all these other characteristics, but underneath in the DNA, they may be the same basic species of bird.
Go ahead.
So I understand, I think I understand federal regulation, and that it can be a pain in the patootie. Let me ask the question another way, and including, you know, what you can do with land that you own and all the rest of it. If one was looking at this problem from the perspective of the lesser or greater prairie chicken, you know, is there concern for the continuation of the species? I'm just asking that question. And is there a way? I mean, I've read in the past that I think was it New Mexico and Texas and some ranchers in Oklahoma had voluntarily committed something like 1 million acres to preservation on their own. In other words, voluntarily. And was that effective? I mean, aside from the cycle that you're talking about, that's a natural cycle. I mean, I'm just curious. I'm just curious, is there a way to preserve the prairie chicken and to engage? I mean, they're your constituents, Representative White, although they can't vote. So my question is simply, I'm just curious about what your experience with this is and how one can. Is there a solution here, or is the solution just, well, the prairie chicken's had its day and adios? I mean, I'm just curious.
Representative White.
I'm new to the committee, so I apologize for the naive question.
Oh, that's just fine. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Younger's territory is the Cimarron National Grasslands. It's been there for coming on 100 years, and people from all over the country come out there to watch them boom. I mean, it's a tourist attraction. I don't get it. That's a long ways from anywhere to see a bird boom. But yes, and I don't know how big that is. It's big. I mean, 100,000 acres. Yeah, and it's not going anywhere, and they're out there.
Well, I'm just trying to get somewhere with this point, with your leave, and that is, if there are effective voluntary ways of dealing with the problems the federal government wants to intervene to deal with, do those exist, and are they there? And is saying no to whatever bill we're looking at now, saying no to the prairie chicken, or is there a way to say we have local ways of dealing with this problem, and please, feds, stay away from here, but we're going to deal with helping the prairie chicken survive on what's left of their 85% diminished habitat.
Right, and I think it goes back to when and do we have our resolution now out, or the Fed's House and Senate resolutions? Okay, committee, you have the House and Senate federal resolution is now in your emails. I think, Representative, it goes back to line kind of 24, 25, where it says, affirm the rights of farmers, ranchers, and energy producers to control their lands to continue their existing proactive measures. This situation will be resolved when we get rain again. It's just really that simple. I'm not a biologist. Representative Blex, though, that's probably the simplest situation. I mean, resolved to where will it come back to full? We don't know, but that's where they see an explosion of population is when conditions are to where we get more moisture, and again, that's an area that doesn't get 40 to 50 inches of rain. It gets 14 to 17 inches, and so that's what happened the last time this happened. Was we put on the on the not necessarily endangered, but in a sense in the watch, and so once the weather pattern turned and we had a wet spring, the population came back. Simply what this resolution says is that we support our federal delegation that says Kansas know what Kansas does best. Now, we are different than, say, those that are endangered in New Mexico especially, because in Kansas, about 3% of our land is owned either by the state or federal government. So we are one of the states that has the least public land. And we can argue if that's right or wrong with access and so on. That's maybe for another day. New Mexico has a large portion of their land, and so that creates other challenges, especially for those that graze cattle, because going through all this different process of all the different agencies to get approval to continue to maintain that way of life, say through a grazing season, that could be fixed again by moisture. So go ahead, yes.
So to get this straight, the federal government can come in and tell you what to do with your property, but not pay you for the impact on your land use, correct?
Representative White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the examples I remember from 10 years ago was this Jim Sipe Farm Bureau said, okay, your son wants to build a house out on the farm somewhere. He has to fund out of his own pocket an impact study. And I think that's what the oil and gas man said by mitigating. And, you know, if they're going to drill an oil well out on me, the first thing they have to do is do this impact study. And it's got to meet federal criteria. Well, if I'm going to build a house, I just doubled the cost. So, yes, in a way, they are telling private landowners you can and cannot do things. Whether it's impactful, I heard somebody say, I think it was Representative Blex, prairie chickens stay away from buildings, and well, they got used to my tractor. I mean, at first a vehicle would drive down the road and they'd fly away, but eventually they'd just, you know, watch me go by within 50 yards of them and not fly. So they do get used to it. They don't like people. Like I said, I was bordered up against 1,000 acres of pasture. That's where they like to be. But they also like the food I was feeding them. So they would fly into my wheat field. That's man-made. If there wasn't ever anything man-made, it's a field. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Shue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this is all a really, really fascinating conversation. So thank you to everybody here and the expertise. And I don't know if this question does have a particular expert in the room. Hopefully Representative Blex does. But is there a level to which, you know, we talked about how when the rainy season comes, they'll repopulate. Is there a level to where it dips down to below to where it no longer becomes feasible or likely that it'll repopulate to older levels, and you know, maybe we hit another dry season or two, unfortunately, and we hit that level? Is that part of it?
Representative Blex.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. General, and I'm not a super expert on the lesser because I'm about 200 miles away for one thing, but basically for the most part, we look at viable wildlife populations. And we can probably harvest in some of those up to either through natural mortality or some form of harvest up to 60 to 70%. But once a population gets down around 20, 25%, so if you start out with 100 birds and you get down to 25, there is a little bit of concern. And the simple reason in Kansas, particularly with the various weather, you could have a huge snowstorm that can stay on and 10 degrees for 2 weeks, and you can have some devastation. You got to remember, most of those birds have a fairly short life, you know, less than 2 years. Like in the case of bobwhite quail, it's about 14 months. So if you have an adverse weather event during that lifetime of 14 months or 2 years, you're in deep trouble. Or if you have an extended drought, which is a real problem there. Now, we have the same issues in eastern Kansas, Mead's milkweed, American burying beetle, that come in. The department used, and don't hold me if they still have it, they used to have a conservation plan with voluntary landowners. There are people out there that want to do something. And they can actually sign up and actually develop a conservation plan for a sink or endangered species or threatened, and they can actually get some property tax breaks on that for doing that. I think there was some incentive payments for some of those programs, but once generally around 25, 30%, you get kind of worried. And as I see this, it's a federal, once you take it out of the grassroots issue, and that's to me the big issue. It's better settled at the local level, and the higher up you go, the worse it gets.
Thank you. And just a quick follow-up. I appreciate the answer as well. Say no matter what anybody does, even if the feds come in or they don't come in, and unfortunately we're not able to repopulate, and then there are no longer any lesser or greater prairie chickens in the state, what type of effect could that have at large on the state? You know, would that do something to their predators? Would that do something to their prey? Do we know?
Representative Blacks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, hunting in the state in general is a huge economic boon. Now, that's only a boon if you've got a harvestable species. If it's gone, it's gone. And sometimes you push that to the limit, and it's all habitat related. It is all habitat and weather, of course, weather events. And that's the whole issue. And we may never, I will never, ever, as much as I hate it, will ever be able to see a quail population in southeast Kansas like I knew when I was a kid, where you had 80 acres and you had 5 to 6 cubbies on that 80 acres, whether you had good management or not. And Representative Gardner, I was just talking about the whys, and I can name about 10. And I think the similar thing is in Sand Sage Prairie and some of the issues out there. And certainly to comment to the representative about prairie chickens on his tractor, that study that done it, they have a natural aversion to structures. That's a tank or a tree, because it's a perching ground for a predator. Your tractor wasn't too much of a perching other than you. So, and the chickens knew that. So consequently, they do get used to things, and you know, they do adapt to agricultural. Some of the best areas that, you know, grain fields that provide feed for them, and particularly when they get the high energy needs when, you know, it gets cold. So it's really a double-edged sword. I mean, I hate to see certain things go that way, but unfortunately, that's probably what it is.
Okay. Representative Roth.
I moved to the Winfield area in '81, and we would go up to Cassidy, where it said it was the prairie. There's a big sign, it said prairie chicken capital of the world. And then west of Winfield, probably 10, 15 miles, or around Dexter, Kansas, the landowners rented or leased property for hunters to come and hunt the prairie chickens because there were so many. And talking to some of the older folks, older than you, the skies used to be black, would be the word that they would use with the numbers of prairie chickens in our area of the state. And then in the late 80s, being with Hunter's Ed, they started talking about the prairie chicken numbers declining, large numbers of prairie chickens. And not so much because of hunters, but because of hawks and owls. Because they could, as my colleague has indicated, these hawks and owls could perch. And so we hunted an area that had a house and an oil well and a tank and stuff like that. And that particular field there, they would come and feed in that field and leave. And so I don't know if they really actually had an aversion to buildings or structures. But my colleague's correct, because the hawks and the owls can perch and decimate the field. We have the same problem with the quail and with pheasants as well, with the hawks and owls. We talk about weather, and hail is terrible, and flooding and stuff like that. I agree with that too, but it's the hawks and owls that have really had a big impact, in my opinion, in 60 years in the field, on a lot of populations, and then a decline of hunters as well. There's not as many coyote hunters. There's not as many trappers trapping foxes and bobcats, and those populations are growing, and they've got to have food. So, okay, thank you for letting me speak.
Representative Minix.
Appreciate it.
I believe Secretary Lovelace said you can still buy a permit to kill prairie chicken, greater prairie chicken, here in the state of Kansas. If they're the same subspecies, or it's hard to differentiate it across, why don't we count those numbers also? When we talk about, Doug's done a really good job of trying to illustrate what habitat does for things. And I can illustrate it. You're all welcome to come to Western Kansas to some of our museums. I can show you mastodon bones. I can show you rhinoceros bones from the dinosaur age. Lots of fish species from the time that it was an inland sea. We've got all kinds of different animals that have existed through the years until their environment went away that they could survive in. So the prairie chicken deal's a little bit like that on a much smaller time frame here that we're looking at. But thank you.
All right. Representative Murphy.
Yeah, I just looked up, thank you, Chair. I just looked up real quick, and it was 1972, they federally protected the owls and the hawks. And maybe that's when we're kind of seeing the decline.
All right, very good, thank you. Representative Featherston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do we know what level the population is now, the diminishment level?
I don't know. I'm looking for an expert or phone a friend. Go ahead, Zach. State your name for the committee, please.
Yeah, excuse me, Zach Pastora, lobbyist for the Kansas Sierra Club, an environmental organization. We have about 5,000 members here in the state. Some of the things I kind of bit my tongue on, but I'll be happy to answer the question on the population. Big reason why this decision came about is that the Fish and Wildlife Services stated that we've lost 90% of the lesser prairie chicken population's historical range. They used to number hundreds of thousands, even millions across 100 million acres. And now their latest was that over a 5-year average in 2022, over a 5-state region, they're at 32,000. Okay, so hundreds of thousands, even millions, and now down to 32,000 across the 5-state region. So the prairie chicken habitat is diminished across the historical range by 90%. That's their words, not mine, and so that might give a little reason why. And they point to it's not exactly predators that are the problem. It's habitat loss and fragmentation of habitat. So you're exactly right, Representative, as far as when the environment declines, the habitat goes away, so do the species. So.
What year was that original population estimate? It was 10 times where we're currently at. That's
right.
The argument on these Threatened Species Act is, what's your baseline? Where do we start at?
Yeah. No, that's an excellent point. I don't have that here listed, but I think it was 1900s and some of those things. So. 100 years or so.
Zach, you got the mic. Anything else since you want to?
Yeah, thank you.
Imagine that.
I want to remind this body that the Kansas Legislature passed a bill in 2014 dealing with a non-migratory wildlife act or bird act or something like that, basically saying that prairie chickens were a concern of our state and shouldn't be concerned of the Endangered Species Act. So I just bring that up because I'm not sure resolutions will do a whole lot. So for what that's worth, if that didn't change the federal government's mind, I don't know if this will. But more important point is that 2019 study of the Endangered Species Act by the Center for Biological Diversity said that 99% of all the species that hit the Endangered Species Act in one form or another, threatened or endangered, have a success rate of 99% of not being extinct. So I think there is a balance. There's certainly, U.S. Fish and Wildlife acknowledges the voluntary conservation efforts that are being done and how that's raised populations numbers in the short term. But in the long term, there's still a historical decline issue here. There's still a habitat issue, and they don't think it's going to be enough to offset the threats and reverse the trends that we're seeing. So that's a little bit their justification. The last thing I'll say is that there is a 4D rule that will provide some, in their words, flexibility for landowners and farmers to try to meet their idea of a conservation effort, a habitat plan, et cetera. So that's what they say. We still got to see some of the specifics about all that, but they take this based on a lot of science. You know, and I know we have a lot of anecdotal stories here, but they're trying to follow the science here. And so I think there's a reason for some of this decision now. I hear what you're saying as far as could our state authorities do better than a federal government, but I just wanted to indicate some of the things going on. I'd be happy to enter my information in the testimony.
Be fine. Make sure you Yes, Representative Fairchild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess this has already been asked, but I just wanted to ask you, what do you think would be the negative unintended consequences for our state if the lesser prairie chicken did go extinct?
Well, I think that's a good question. I think there's a lot that we're seeing that you can't take back an ecological treasure that is our species. You can't take the ecological treasure that is our environment and habitat there. We've lost so much of it. Think about what we'd be if we didn't have the tall grass prairie. Well, this is dealing with the short grass prairie and the sagebrush ecosystem. And so, you know, we think about those things, and we also have to deal with the water, you know, and how water, we're seeing those ecosystems that used to have water and the creeks going down their area aren't there anymore because we've taken too much water out. So, you know, the way we kind of should view, I think, wildlife species is that it's part of the ecosystem and it's an indicator of the ecosystem. So if we lose our species, that's a sign we're losing our ecosystems as well. So I don't know if that, there's no monetary value there, I don't know of. So.
Is there some type of, you know, what type of animals would they eat? Do they eat any type of, you know, insects or something that would, you know, would that cause some problems as far as something else getting too big or too much population? Or?
Those are very valid questions. I probably shouldn't, I don't know enough to answer those questions, so I'm sorry about that, Representative.
Representative Featherston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Do we expect to hear from Secretary Lovelace with, like, the state's plan?
We can, I guess. As far as the state's plan, I don't know this. If there's a state's plan per se. This resolution says we support what the federal delegation is doing. As far as is the state going to, you know, are we trying to direct Secretary of Wildlife and Parks to do something? No. I am no scientist, but I've lived enough years to know that when it rains, there's a party. And when there's a party, there's birds. And that's about as family friendly as I can get. I've seen it. I've experienced, you know, I've seen what happens. And not to make light of it, it's an important thing. And to think that, you know, you can go to Sternberg Museum at Hayes and see what was and what is not now, maybe on the High Plains and other areas around the state. Things like that happen. And I think our farmers and ranchers and energy producers need to be commended for what they've done. And I think you see a revitalized effort by many stakeholders as we deal with water and natural resources. And this is one thing to basically say that, you know, EPA, you have your role, but and others, but maybe the role of EPA and Fish and Wildlife is not determining what works best for the prairie chicken, especially in Kansas. So that's it. Representative Gardner, last word.
Okay. I just have kind of an open question. I don't know who to direct this at. What interventions and controls does the federal government have in mind and the authority to implement that would benefit this species that isn't being done by our local farmers and scientists here in Kansas now? You know, I would just add to that, you know, we have a decline in quail in our area, a significant decline, and we have personally invested time and effort in habitat restoration, and we've seen some response from that, and that's all private landowner done. We're not the only ones in our area doing that, and it has made some difference. And I guess my question is, beyond that, what does the federal government have in mind to, you know, you can declare it endangered species, but what's the plan? Do we know, and how is that going to be superior to what we're doing now?
Well, believe what we do know now is that threatened and endangered have different plans. And so, Mr. Cross, you might double check with me here to make sure I don't speak out of turn. But some I know in some of the grazing, there are not only grazing plans, but there are working on some conservation acres. Same thing, I believe, with the energy industry. And it creates a lot of bureaucracy in trying to save a bird that, what I understand, Representative Gardner, is if again, I go back to, if the weather pattern changes, we get moisture in the spring, by the time some of these paperwork issues get solved, we could be back to having a nice population. So, Mr. Cross, anything else that you?
I'm not a biologist either. I'm a geologist by training, but the conservation, you know, they listed it back in 2014, and then you know, they were challenged in court and lost, and they took it back off the list, and so they went through the things again. But of all the voluntary conservation programs out there that oil and gas, as well as farmers and everyone else, has done, has helped with that, and I agree with you, Mr. Chairman. As a non-biologist, you can obviously see that whenever it rains, the population goes up, and when there's not rain, it goes down. You know, right now, the Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of Interior, for that matter, you know, none of the things that they're proposing is going to do anything more than what the voluntary conservation programs are doing now. The other thing they don't have is they don't have any way of saying, here's, if we do follow all of these rules, this is what it takes to delist it. They want to keep it listed in perpetuity. So there needs to be a in there that says if we can do these things and the population gets to here, then we need to delist it. You know, I'm encouraged to hear that you know, maybe the greater and lesser prairie chicken are not the separate species. I don't know. I'm not here to say that or not, but it's interesting, and I'd be interested in hear that study as well.
Okay, very good. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for the participation today. I think we learned a whole lot more than what I was expecting to learn about the lessers and the graders and the in-betweens. All I know is pretty simple. In my house, we eat beef. So I know and it's now on tape, and so I'll get the letters and the phone calls. But anyway, we will work on the final designation of this resolution, but committee members, you should have the federal ones as well. And if you do have questions, let us know. We'll probably reach out to the secretary and see if Secretary Lovelace can come and talk about about some things that they're doing. I'm sure he'll be visiting us with a couple of other issues that we're working our way through the committee. So with that, just with no meetings then the rest of the week, and next week we will be on Tuesday, Dr. Minton from K-State will be joining us online. He is, I think, been called back to D.C. for some federal situations, so he won't be here in person. But that's also the K-State KU game, in case anybody cared after what happened last night and KU's 14-game losing streak. Or no, I don't know, whatever they're on. But it'll be a day to wear purple if you'd like. So, no. And also then, on February 2nd, we will be having a presentation by Dale Strickler, kind of a discussion on, he does a lot of things with soil, cover crops, and so on. And this is maybe something outside the box, but he's around the Iola area, and I think you might find his presentation kind of interesting. He has spoken of things like no-till in the plains that's going on right now, or in Salina, and some of those things. And so it's you know, we're kind of here to learn as well. And then probably we will start working bills the week of the 5th. But again, right now, we are not planning on meeting Fridays unless for some reason we need to. I don't see us ever meeting on a Friday so you can get home. And so we may be on the floor for a little bit, but as far as for you to be here at 5 o'clock on a Friday, it probably don't take place. So with that, we are adjourned until Tuesday, January 31st.